The wind has a voice in the Dakota Territory, and on that particular afternoon, it was screaming a sermon of dust and ruin. Eleanora Hayes stood on the porch of the sagging farmhouse, a single sheet of paper trembling in her hand. The ink was a stark, unforgiving black against the cream-colored letterhead of the Prairie Fidelity Bank. Words like delinquency, foreclosure, and final notice were whips that flayed the fragile hope she had been nursing for months. Around her, the world was a monochrome of brown dust and pale, unforgiving sky. The farm, her late husband Arthur's only legacy, was dying of thirst, and this letter was its death certificate. She is not alone in this fight, however. A small clatter from inside reminds her of the 6 other heartbeats, now, depending on this land, on her. They are a ragtag collection of orphans she found huddled in the abandoned church, and now their desperation is tangled up with her own. This farm is their last chance, and the man who signed this letter, a banker named Silas Abernathy, is the architect of their impending doom. The wind snatches at the paper, trying to tear it from her grasp, as if to underscore the finality of his judgment. And with the threat of eviction hanging over them like a hawk, Eleanora knows that a storm far worse than dust is about to break. Before we see how Eleanora and her young charges face this impossible challenge, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The letter wasn't just a threat, it was a ghost. It was the ghost of a promise made and broken in the space of a single season. Eleanora had arrived 3 months prior, a mail-order bride stepping off the train into the bustling noise of Prosperity Creek. She had expected a man named Arthur Hayes, described in his letters as sturdy and hopeful, with a modest but promising plot of land. What she found was a man worn thin by the land, his hope a flickering candle against the prairie wind. He was kind, if quiet, his hands calloused, and his eyes holding the permanent squint of a man who spent his days staring into the sun. He died 6 weeks after their wedding. A fool accident with a spooked horse and a poorly dug well. There was no ceremony to speak of, just a few neighbors offering condolences that felt more like assessments of her dire situation. The pity in their eyes was sharp and quick, and it curdled into skepticism before Arthur's grave was a week old. She was an outsider, a woman alone on a piece of land that had already broken a stronger man. The farm was mortgaged to the hilt, a fact Arthur had conveniently omitted from his letters. The debt was held by the Prairie Fidelity Bank, an institution that felt as remote and unfeeling as the moon, personified by its president, Silas Abernathy. Abernathy was a man carved from the same granite that lay just beneath the thin topsoil of the territory. She saw him only once in town, a tall, severe figure in a black suit that seemed to absorb the sunlight and give nothing back. He moved through the dusty street with an air of cold authority, his gaze sweeping over the townspeople with an unnerving lack of interest. He was, she'd heard, a widower himself, but whatever grief he carried was locked away behind a facade of impenetrable business. He was the ledger, the interest rate, the final notice. He was the man who would, without a flicker of emotion, turn her and her newfound family out onto the open plains. Her family. That was the most unexpected complication of all. A week after Arthur's death, seeking solace in the quiet of the town's disused church, she'd heard a noise from the cellar. Not rats, but whispers. She found them there, huddled together on a pile of old burlap sacks. 6 children, ranging in age from 5 to 14. They were the town's forgotten footnotes, children of miners lost to a cave-in, of farmers lost to fever, of parents who had simply moved on. They were unofficially cared for by the overworked reverend, which meant they were mostly left to fend for themselves. Their leader was a boy of 14 named Samuel, with wary eyes and shoulders already burdened with a man's responsibility. There was quiet, watchful Mary, who was 12 and mothered the younger ones. There were the 9-year-old twins, Thomas and Finn, wiry bundles of nervous energy. And then there was 6-year-old Lily, a tiny thing with enormous, solemn eyes, and 5-year-old Ben, who clung to Lily's patched dress as if it were a lifeline. Looking at them, Eleonora saw her own desperation mirrored in their hungry faces. She had nothing. They had less than nothing. That night, she didn't return to the empty farmhouse alone. She walked back with 6 small shadows trailing behind her, their bare feet kicking up dust in the twilight. The townsfolk whispered, "That Hayes woman, she's collecting strays now, folly on top of folly. Abernathy will have that land before the first snow." The whispers were another kind of wind, one that sought to erode her spirit. But in the quiet of the farmhouse, with 6 children sleeping on pallets on the floor, Eleonora felt something she hadn't felt since she'd stepped off the train. Purpose. This wasn't just her farm to lose anymore. It was her sanctuary. The bank's letter might have been a death certificate, but as she looked at the sleeping children, Eleonora decided it would be a declaration of war instead. The declaration came the next morning, not with a bugle call, but with the rasp of a cellar door being dragged open. Down in the cool, musty dark, Eleonora found what she was looking for, a half-dozen canvas sacks, fat with Arthur's seed wheat. It was meant for the next planting season, a season Arthur would never see. To sell it would bring in a pittance, perhaps enough for a few weeks of food. But to plant it, that was a gamble of epic proportions. It was a bet against the drought, against the coming winter, against the cold arithmetic of Silas Abernathy's ledger. She hauled one of the sacks into the main room, the effort making her arms burn. She slit it open with a kitchen knife, and a river of golden kernels spilled onto the rough-hewn floorboards. The children gathered around, their eyes wide. "What's that for?" Samuel asked, his voice laced with the suspicion he reserved for all adults. Eleonora met his gaze, her own steady and clear. "That," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "is our future. Or it's nothing. That part is up to us." She knelt down, running her fingers through the wheat. "Mr. Abernathy and his bank think this land is worthless. They think we are worthless. They're waiting for us to fail. We're going to prove them wrong." She laid out the plan, simple and brutal in its logic. They would plow the 10 acres Arthur had let go fallow. They would plant this wheat. They would pray for rain. They would harvest it and sell it. And they would march into Silas Abernathy's bank and pay the mortgage. A silence fell over the room, thick with doubt. Thomas kicked at a loose floorboard. Mary bit her lip. It was Samuel who gave voice to their fear. "We ain't farmers. We're nothing. And you're not our ma. This ain't our farm to save." The words stung, but Eleonora understood them. They were the words of a boy who had learned that hope was a dangerous thing. She didn't scold him. She simply looked at him, then at the others. "You're right, Samuel. I'm not your mother. And this isn't your farm by law. But it's our home for as long as we can keep it. And we are not nothing. We are a family. A strange one, maybe, but a family. And families work together." She held out a hand, palm up, covered in fine dust from the wheat. "We work or we starve. We plant this or we lose the only roof we have. The choice is ours." For a long moment, nobody moved. The fate of their small, defiant enterprise hung in the balance. Then, slowly, Samuel stepped forward. He looked at her hand, then at her face, and gave a short, sharp nod. He knelt beside her and scooped up a handful of wheat. One by one, the others followed, their small hands reaching into the pile, the golden kernels a tangible promise in the dim light of the farmhouse. The work had begun. The days that followed blurred into a singular, aching effort. The sun was a merciless tyrant, beating down on the cracked earth. The old plow was a beast of rust and iron, and Arthur's aging mule, Moses, was as stubborn as the land itself. Eleonora and Samuel wrestled with the plow, their hands, soft and unaccustomed to such labor, quickly blistering and then bleeding. The first day, they managed only 2 crooked furrows that looked like ugly scars on the face of the field. The younger children were tasked with clearing stones, a seemingly endless chore. They worked in a line, their small backs bent, piling rocks at the edge of the field. Thomas and Finn turned it into a competition, their initial enthusiasm waning as the heat intensified and their muscles screamed in protest. Mary, ever practical, took charge of the domestic front. She organized the meager rations, patched their worn clothing, and ensured a bucket of water was always waiting at the end of a row. Lily and Ben, too small for the heavy work, were given the job of pulling weeds from the small vegetable garden, their childish chatter a strange counterpoint to the grunts and groans from the field. Their first real test came not from the land, but from within. After 3 days of grueling, seemingly fruitless labor, Finn threw down his rock bucket. "I'm not doing it no more," he wailed, tears carving clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. "It's too hard. Arthur couldn't do it. We can't either." His despair was contagious. Thomas stopped, his shoulders slumping. Even Samuel paused, his face a mask of exhaustion and doubt. Eleanor's own body was a symphony of pain. Her back felt as if it might snap, and her hands were raw. It would be so easy to give in, to admit defeat. Instead, she walked over to Finn, kneeling in the dirt beside him. She didn't offer false reassurances. "Yes, it's hard," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It might be the hardest thing any of us will ever do. Arthur tried to do it alone. We are not alone." She pointed to the small pile of rocks he had made. "Look at that. Yesterday, those rocks were in the field. Today, they are not. That is your work. It's real." She then pointed to the 2 new furrows they had managed to plow that morning. "And that is Samuel's work. And my work. It's not much, but it's more than we had yesterday. We're not fighting the whole field at once. We're just fighting for the next foot. Can you fight for one more foot, Finn?" He sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve. He looked at his small pile of rocks, then at the vast, uncleared field. He nodded, a barely perceptible movement. He picked up his bucket and, with a renewed, if weary, determination, went back to work. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. It was the moment they stopped being a collection of individuals and started becoming a single, stubborn unit. Their strange endeavor did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark silhouette against the glaring sky. As he drew closer, Eleanor felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. It was Silas Abernathy. He reined in his immaculate black horse at the edge of their pathetic-looking field and simply watched. He didn't dismount. He just sat there, his posture rigid, his gaze sweeping over the scene with the detached air of a man appraising livestock. He took in the sight of Eleanor, her dress stained with sweat and dirt, her hair escaping its bun in wild tendrils. He saw Samuel, straining against the plow, and the small children bent over their work like penitents. Eleanor's first instinct was to feel shame. She wanted to hide her raw hands, to smooth her dress, to command the children to stand up straight. But then a different feeling took over, defiance. She dropped the handles of the plow, wiped her forehead with the back of her arm, leaving a muddy streak, and stared right back at him. She would not let this man make her feel small. After a long, tense silence that stretched for an eternity, Abernathy spoke, his voice carrying easily on the dry air. It was as crisp and emotionless as she remembered. "An ambitious project, Mrs. Hayes." It wasn't a compliment. It was a judgment. "It's necessary work, Mr. Abernathy," she replied, her own voice tight. He looked at the children, his eyes lingering on them for a moment before returning to her. "Sentiment doesn't pay debts. The note is due on the 1st of October, not a day later." He didn't wait for a reply. He simply turned his horse with a practiced, elegant movement and rode away, leaving them in a cloud of dust and humiliation. The children had all stopped working to watch him, their faces a mixture of fear and resentment. "He's a mean one," Samuel muttered, spitting into the dirt. "He's just a man, Samuel," Eleanor said, though the words fell hollow. In that moment, Silas Abernathy felt like much more than a man. He was the embodiment of the cold, hard world that was waiting for them to fail. His visit, meant to intimidate, had the opposite effect. It fueled their resolve. They worked with a renewed fury. The image of his disdainful face burned into their minds. They were no longer just working for survival. They were working to spite him. The weeks turned into a month. The plowing was finished, the field a grid of dark, promising earth. The planting began. Eleanor taught the older children how to walk the furrows, casting the seed with a steady, rhythmic motion. The younger ones followed behind, using makeshift rakes to gently cover the precious kernels. They worked from sunrise to sunset, their bodies growing stronger, their skin turning brown from the sun. The farmhouse, once a place of quiet grief, was now filled with the noise of life. The tired sighs at the end of the day, the arguments over who got the last biscuit, the shared, weary laughter over a clumsy mistake. Eleonora discovered the hidden facets of her charges. Samuel, she learned, had a keen mind for numbers and strategy, helping her calculate their seed distribution and plan the harvest. Mary possessed a quiet, unshakable strength, a calming presence when tempers flared. Thomas and Finn, for all their boisterous energy, were fiercely protective of the younger children. And Lily, sweet, quiet Lily, had a gift for finding beauty in the harshest of landscapes. She would bring Eleonora wildflowers she'd found growing by the creek or a perfectly shaped stone, her small offerings of balm to Eleonora's weary soul. Their progress was painfully slow, marked by small triumphs and crushing setbacks. A handle on the plow finally snapped, a piece of metal worn thin by years of use. There was no money for a blacksmith. After a tense, whispered conference, Eleonora made a decision. She took down the silver-backed hand mirror that had been her mother's, the last beautiful thing she owned, and sent Samuel into town with it. He returned hours later, his face grim but triumphant, with a newly forged handle and a small sack of flour. He never told her what the storekeeper had said, but she saw the lingering shame in his eyes and knew he had endured the town's scorn for them. She hung the new handle on its peg with a feeling of both loss and fierce pride. The first true moment of hope came on a cool morning a week later. It was Lily who saw it first. She came running from the field, her face alight with a joy so pure it was breathtaking. Nora, come see." Eleonora followed her out to the field, the other children trailing behind. And there, poking through the dark soil, were countless tiny green shoots, a fragile, vibrant carpet stretching across the acres they had worked so hard to tame. A collective gasp went through the children. Ben reached out a tentative finger to touch one, as if to confirm it was real. Finn let out a whoop of joy and began to dance between the rows. Eleonora felt tears well in her eyes, hot and sudden. She sank to her knees, scooping up a handful of the soil, the green shoots cool against her palm. It was life. It was a promise. All the blisters, all the aching muscles, all the fear and doubt. It was all worth it for this one perfect moment. They had done it. They had brought life out of the dead earth. But the prairie was a fickle partner. Their elation was short-lived. The almanac, which Samuel now studied with religious fervor, predicted a late frost. A single cold night could kill the tender young wheat, wiping out their entire investment of sweat and hope. Panic set in. "We have to cover them," Samuel said, his voice tight with urgency. "With what?" Mary asked, her practical nature cutting through the fear. "We have barely enough blankets for ourselves." They stood at the edge of the field as twilight fell, the air growing colder by the minute, a feeling of helplessness descending upon them. They had come so far, only to be threatened by something as simple and unstoppable as the cold. Eleonora looked at the darkening sky, then at the faces of the children, their hope from that morning already beginning to fade. She would not let it be extinguished. "Then we will build fires," she declared. "Small ones, all through the field. We'll stay up all night. We will keep the cold at bay." It was a desperate, exhausting plan. They spent the next hour gathering every scrap of dry wood, every fallen branch they could find. They laid out small pyres every 20 feet, dotting the field with potential warmth. As the last of the light faded and a chill wind began to snake across the plains, they lit the first fire. The night became a surreal vigil. Eleonora and the older children moved through the field like ghosts, tending the small fires, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. The smoke stung their eyes and the cold seeped into their bones, but they kept moving. They told stories to stay awake, their voices low and hoarse. They huddled together for warmth between trips to the woodpile. It was a battle fought in silence and darkness, a struggle against the elements that was as much a test of their will as their strength. As the first hint of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of gray and pink, they knew they had won. The ground was cold, but not frozen. The small green shoots stood proudly, untouched by the frost. Exhausted, smoke-stained, and shivering, they huddled together at the edge of the field and watched the sun rise on their victory. They had faced down the cold, and their small crop had survived. News of their all-night vigil traveled to town, carried on the morning breeze like milkweed fluff. It was dismissed by most as the desperate act of a foolish woman. In the Prairie Fidelity Bank, Silas Abernathy heard the story from a clerk and showed no reaction at all. His face remained an impassive mask. But one farmer, a man who had lost his own crop to that same frost, privately remarked that the Hayes woman had more grit than any two men in the county. The season turned. The rains, when they came, were gentle and steady, as if rewarding their faith. The wheat grew, transforming from fragile shoots into a sea of verdant green, and then, as summer reached its peak, into a field of rippling gold. It was a magnificent sight, a testament to their relentless labor. The children would often just stand at the edge of the field, watching the wind move through the wheat, a look of profound ownership on their faces. They had not just planted a crop. They had created a miracle. One afternoon, as Eleonora was mending a tear in Thomas's shirt on the porch, she saw Abernathy's horse in the distance again. This time, he didn't ride to the edge of the field. He was on a main road, but he had stopped. He was looking at the wheat, a tall, dark figure stark against the brilliant gold. He sat there for a long time, so long that Eleonora began to feel uneasy. Just then, Lily, who had been chasing grasshoppers near the road, let out a small cry. She had tripped and fallen, dropping the small, carved wooden bird she carried everywhere, a whittled treasure her father had made for her before he'd gone to the mines and never come back. The bird skittered across the dusty road, coming to a stop near Abernathy's horse. Eleonora held her breath. The horse shifted nervously. She expected Abernathy to ignore it, to ride on. Instead, he dismounted. He bent down, his movement stiff, and picked up the small carving. He held it in his palm, staring at it. From the porch, Eleonora could not see his expression, but she saw the tension in his shoulders. He didn't call out to Lily or try to return it. He simply looked at the bird for a long, strange moment, then slipped it into his coat pocket, mounted his horse, and rode away towards town. Lily ran back to the porch, crying over her lost treasure. Eleonora comforted her, but a cold unease settled over her. Why would he take it? Was it petty cruelty? A warning? She couldn't decipher the man's actions, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that their fates were converging, and the harvest would be more than a simple reckoning of accounts. It would be a final confrontation with the man who held their future in his hands, and who now held a piece of their past in his pocket. The harvest was a frantic, feverish race against time. The 1st of October loomed, the date engraved on Eleonora's mind like a tombstone inscription. They had no scythes, only hand sickles and knives. The work was slow and agonizing. They rose before the sun and worked until their muscles gave out, their hands raw and bleeding despite being wrapped in rags. The golden wheat they had nurtured felt like an enemy now, its sharp stalks scratching their arms and faces. Samuel organized them into an efficient, if exhausted, team. He and Eleonora cut the stalks, while Mary and Thomas bundled them into sheaves. Finn and the younger ones gathered the fallen heads of grain, knowing that every single kernel counted. They threshed it the old way, by beating the sheaves against a hard-packed patch of earth, the rhythmic thudding a constant heartbeat of their desperation. The chaff flew into the air, coating them in a fine, itchy dust that worked its way into their hair, their clothes, and their lungs. When the last stalk was cut and the last grain threshed, they stood before a mountain of golden wheat, a monument to their impossible effort. They were gaunt and bone-weary, but a current of pride ran through them. They had done it. They had brought in the harvest. The triumph was short-lived. The next day, Samuel and Eleonora loaded the grain onto their rickety wagon and made the long, slow journey to the mill in Prosperity Creek. The miller, a shrewd man with eyes that missed nothing, weighed their yield. He did his calculations on a slate board, the chalk squeaking in the quiet mill. Eleonora's heart hammered against her ribs. Finally, he looked up, his expression neutral. "It's a good yield, Mrs. Hayes. A fine yield, considering he named a price." Eleonora's mind raced. She did the arithmetic she had done 100 times in her head. She counted the banknotes the miller placed in her hand, her fingers trembling slightly. And then her heart sank. It wasn't enough. They were short. Not by much, $20, but in a world where a dollar could mean the difference between eating and starving, $20 was a chasm. The ride back to the farm was silent. The weight of their failure pressed down on them, heavier than any sack of grain. That evening, Eleonora gathered the children in the main room. She laid the money on the table, the pile of bills looking pitifully small. "We did our best," she said, her voice thick with emotion she fought to control. "We worked harder than anyone could have asked. But it's not enough." Tears welled in Lily's eyes. Finn kicked at the leg of the table, his face a thundercloud of anger and disappointment. Samuel simply stared at the money, his jaw tight. He had poured every ounce of his adolescent strength into this endeavor, and it had failed. "So he wins," Samuel said, his voice flat and dead. "The banker wins." Eleonora looked at their defeated faces, at the 6 children who had dared to hope with her. She had brought them here, made them this promise, and she had led them to this cliff edge. A wave of despair washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. But then she looked at Ben, who had fallen asleep with his head in Mary's lap, his face peaceful and innocent. She thought of their all-night vigil in the field, of Finn's small pile of rocks, of Samuel returning from town with his head held high. They had not failed. To have come this far was a victory in itself. She straightened her shoulders. "No," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction that surprised even herself. "He does not win. We will not sneak away in the night. We will not be branded as cowards who ran from their debts. Tomorrow is the 1st of October. We will go to the bank. We will give him what we have. We will look him in the eye and tell him we will work to pay the rest. We will face him with honor, no matter what comes." The morning of October 1st dawned gray and cold. Eleonora dressed in her best dress, the one she was married in. It hung loosely on her frame now. She brushed the children's hair and wiped their faces, dressing them in their cleanest, most mended clothes. They looked like a small, solemn delegation on their way to a surrender. They walked into Prosperity Creek, not on the wagon, but on foot. It was a pilgrimage of sorts, a final defiant act. The townspeople stopped to watch them pass, their whispers following them like stray dogs. The group of them, the strange bride and her flock of orphans, paused before the imposing facade of the Prairie Fidelity Bank. Taking a deep breath, Eleonora pushed open the heavy door. The bank was silent and cool, a temple dedicated to commerce. At the far end of the room, behind a polished mahogany desk, sat Silas Abernathy. He looked up as they entered, his face betraying no surprise, only a cold, professional stillness. Eleonora walked the length of the room, her footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The children followed, a tight, nervous cluster behind her. She reached his desk and placed the worn stack of banknotes upon its gleaming surface. "Mr. Abernathy," she began, her voice steady. "This is the proceeds from the harvest. It is not the full amount of the payment due today. We are $20 short." He did not look at the money. His eyes were fixed on her face. "We are not asking for charity," she continued, lifting her chin. "We are asking for time. We will work to pay the remainder of the debt. The children and I, we will find a way." Abernathy was silent for a long moment. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze finally dropping from her to the children huddled behind her. His eyes swept over Samuel's defiant posture, Mary's quiet dignity, and then they landed on Lily, who was clutching a fold of Eleonora's skirt, her own eyes wide with fear. Then the impossible happened. A flicker of something, not pity, but a deeper, more complex emotion crossed his face. He slowly opened a drawer in his desk and took something out. He placed it on the desk. It was the small, carved wooden bird. "You," he said, his voice no longer crisp, but rough, as if dredged up from a deep well. He was looking directly at Lily. "Where did you get this?" Lily shrank behind Eleonora, but Eleonora gave her an encouraging nod. "My papa made it for me," Lily whispered, her voice barely audible. Before he went away, Abernathy leaned forward, his composure finally cracking. The mask was gone, and underneath was a man Eleonora had never seen before, a man etched with an old and profound sorrow. "Your papa," was his name, Daniel. Lily looked up, surprised. She nodded. The air in the bank seemed to crackle. The clerks had stopped their work, staring openly. Abernathy's voice was now thick with a grief that was decades old. "Daniel was my brother, my younger brother." He looked at Eleonora, his eyes pleading for understanding. "We had a falling out many years ago. Our father was a hard man. He disapproved of the woman Daniel chose to marry, a girl with no family, no standing. He disowned him. I was weak. I stood with my father. I let him go." He looked back at the bird in his hand. "Our father taught us both to carve like this when we were boys. This bird, it's his mark. I've searched for him for years, but he vanished. I never knew he had a child." His gaze fell upon Lily again, and in it was the pain of 1,000 regrets. He looked at the hard-earned money on his desk. He looked at the foreclosure notice waiting for his signature. He looked at Eleonora's proud, exhausted face and the small, resilient family standing behind her. Then, with a sudden, decisive movement, he reached for the mortgage document. It was a thick sheaf of papers, the legal instrument of their ruin. The room was utterly silent. With a sharp, tearing sound that echoed like a gunshot, Silas Abernathy ripped the mortgage in two. He then ripped the pieces again and again until they were just scraps of paper. He dropped them into the wastebasket beside his desk. He looked up at Eleonora, his eyes clear for the first time. "The debt," he said, his voice raw but firm, "is paid in full. The farm is yours." The walk back to the farm was a dream. The gray sky seemed to have lifted, and a pale, watery sunlight broke through the clouds. The children were quiet, trying to process the miracle they had just witnessed. Silas Abernathy, Uncle Silas, as he had insisted they call him, had walked with them to the edge of town, holding Lily's hand the entire way. He promised to visit them at the farm the next day. It wasn't charity. Eleonora knew that. It was something more profound. It was restitution. It was a man trying to mend a family he had broken, a man finding a piece of his own lost heart in a field of golden wheat and the face of a little girl. That evening, a different kind of quiet settled over the farmhouse. It was not the silence of grief or exhaustion, but of peace. Eleonora stood on the porch, looking out at the field of harvested stubble. It wasn't a scene of emptiness, but of promise. The earth was resting, ready for the next season. Samuel came to stand beside her. He was no longer the wary, angry boy she had found in the church cellar. He was a young man who had seen a harvest through. "He's not so mean after all, is he?" he said quietly. "No, Samuel," Eleonora replied, a small smile touching her lips. "He's just a man who was lost for a very long time." She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the deceptive letters, the sudden widowhood, the discovery of the children, the back-breaking labor. She had arrived in Prosperity Creek, seeking a husband and a home. She had lost the husband, but in the struggle to save his land, she had found something infinitely more valuable. She had forged a family from the discarded scraps of the world, built a home with her own two hands, and cultivated a harvest of hope from the most barren of soils. The wind still whispered across the prairie, but its voice had changed. It no longer screamed of ruin, but hummed a low, steady tune of resilience and new beginnings. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.